You just ate 2 people yesterday. How can you possibly still be hungry? You are such a child. Fine, let's go. In today's video, I'm going to be remaking the VFX from Venom. There's 3 main effects to cover in this video, and then a couple of invisible effects that I'll cover as I go as well. The first one is Venom in the floating head form. Then there's the transform from me into a full CG version of Venom. And then finally there's the end shot, which is done fully in 3D using Blender. Let's get stuck in. First of all, I needed some sort of 3D model. I could have tried to make this from scratch, but it would have taken ages, and this video would have taken even longer to make, so I scoured the internet and found this really good one instead on Sketchfab. As well as the model and textures being pretty good, this model also came fully rigged and already had a load of shape keys set up for the different facial poses, which saved me a huge amount of time having to do those myself. I made some small adjustments to the shaders and then saved this in a master file that I will then append into all my other VFX shots. Then I also made a separate master file that was for the floating head version of Venom. For this, I went into edit mode and deleted the rest of the body, and then used the sculpting tools to slightly refine the edges around the neck. Once the head was isolated, I created a separate vertex group for the back of the head around the edges. Then I can use this vertex group in a displace modifier and constrain the displacement just to that area. This allowed me to recreate the flowing edges on the side of the head that you see in the film. Then I used an empty object with some location keyframes on it to define how quickly the displacement would move. I set 2 keyframes and then set them to linear extrapolation so they would continue forever at the same speed. And then by changing the distance between the 2 keyframes, I can speed up or slow down the displacement until it feels like it's moving at the correct speed. To model the tendrils that come out of the back of Venom's head, I created some cylinders, extruded them backwards and added some loop cuts to create some extra geometry. I applied a subdivision surface modifier to smooth it out slightly, and then also gave this cylinder a displacement modifier as well. I set the speed of the displacement to be driven by the empty again, and then once I was happy I duplicated these a few times, changing the scale to add some variety, and created the rest. I didn't spend a huge amount of time making these really detailed because I knew they would be close to the camera, dark and out of focus for pretty much all the shots. Once I was happy with how they were looking, I created a bendy bone armature system, and I put some constraints on each end that would allow the bendy bone to stretch to where the 2 control points were. This means I can set the base bone to be the position of my back and attach it to my torso, and then the bone at the tip allows me to control the rotation and the position of the head. To ensure that the tendrils would actually feel attached to my torso, I did a 1-point object track on my chest, and then turned this into an empty and 3D space that I can parent the bendy bone to. I used a child off constraint on the base bone, which means this will now follow my chest movement, but the other end of the rig with the head is unaffected by this and can move independently still. For most of the shots I added some subtle rotation and movement onto the head bone, as well as obviously the poses for the face, and I used a few very subtle noise modifiers to add some extra organic movement as well. Once I had the head tracked in and roughly moving where I wanted it in the shot, I would go through and refine the facial animation. To start off with, I would just get the mouth moving correctly by rotating the jaw bones, and then after that I would move on to the finer details, which involved keyframing the shape keys to get all the different facial poses. As the Venom head isn't doing much talking in this, a lot of the expression just comes from the eyes and the mouth, so I'm using lots of the shape keys that control the lips moving up and down over the teeth, changing the shapes of the eyes and also making the holes in the cheeks flare up and get wider and narrower throughout the shot. I also animated the tongue in some shots just to add some extra detail. The shape key on the tongue allows me to extend it in and out of the mouth, and then there's a bone at the end similar to the bendy bone system for the neck that allows me to control where the tip of the tongue goes and animate its rotation from there. So in some of the shots I have it flicking in and out of the mouth to add some extra expression, or in the shot where the head turns back into my body, the tongue whips out of the mouth and follows the animation of the head but a few seconds behind to make it feel like it's being dragged along. When I was doing some of the initial research and planning for this video, I watched some of the VFX breakdowns from the films, and I noticed at one point they were talking about how they approach lighting Venom the same as lighting a car commercial. Because his body is so dark and it's difficult to read much detail in that form, they had to place the lights very specifically to create specular highlights across Venom's body that would enhance and complement his figure. So I tried to do a similar thing by putting a few lights in my shot. One of them was above my head and creating a soft top-down light as if to mimic the lighting from the ceiling in the room. And then I also put quite a bright edge light on myself to create some separation between the foreground and the background. This edge light also gets picked up on the Venom model and gives some definition to the silhouette. I took 2 different HDRIs for the 2 different lighting setups that I had, and I placed a color chart on the table so I could use this to neutralize the HDRIs later. This is really important because the 360 camera that took the HDRI shoots in a totally different color space from the main camera that I use for all the main shots. This means the way the 2 cameras perceive all the different colors on the spectrum will be completely different. So by using a color chart and setting a base level for what each color should look like in the camera, it allows me to create uniformity between everything. Then I hold up the color chart in front of the main camera that I'm using to shoot everything else on, and I do exactly the same process. So I use color target to create a neutral grade. Later on I can then reverse this color transform to make the CG exactly the same color as my plate. Then I can bring the color balanced version of the HDRIs into Blender, set them up in my scene, and then put a digital version of the color chart in front of the camera. By placing this in front of the camera and doing a quick render and then sampling the middle grey square, I can check that the strength of the HDRI in my 3D scene is the same strength as the real lights that were used in my living room. Once this is dialed in and the rotation of the HDRI is set up properly, in theory all the lighting and colour should be very cohesive between my CG and the real footage. All the nuke scripts for the floating headshots looked fairly similar. They're something like this. At the very top I have an exposure node with a couple of masks that I'm just using to pull down the left hand wall behind Venom. I felt it was quite bright, so I graded it down a bit so that it would be less distracting, and that would help the head stand out. Then obviously we have the 3D render of the head. This is what the render looks like straight out of Blender without any comp work applied. The main thing going on here is the inverse color transform that I mentioned earlier that I generated from the color chart. This makes all of the colors of the CG match really nicely with the footage of me. Underneath this I've got a couple of grade nodes just adjusting other parts of the head. I output an AOV that was a matte for the eyes, so I could use that in Nuke to grade them up and down. This helped to make them pop a bit more and exaggerate the facial expressions. And I'm also using a Cryptomatte here just to make the mouth a bit darker, as I felt the teeth were slightly bright. Under this I've got a really soft mask behind my back that's darkening the tentacles as they go behind me. This is just faking a little bit of contact shadow interaction. Then lastly there's a grade node that's just making the black point of the CG render match to the black point of the footage. So I'm lifting that up, and I did this by sampling the black of my t-shirt in the shot. I've got a tiny amount of defocus on this just to soften the CG render to match the softness of my plate, and underneath this I'm integrating a small amount of noise that's sampled from the plate. This is so that the CG render and the footage have the same amount of noise across them. Obviously parts of the render need to be behind me, so I rotoed my torso and cut that out and put it back on top of the render. One of the invisible effects I mentioned earlier is that the fork is actually comped in this shot. I didn't want to be throwing food around my kitchen for this video, so I held the fork up to camera, took a still of it, and then tracked it back onto my hand. I turned on motion blur in the tracker so that it moved convincingly, and then rotated my fingertip back on top to make it look like I'm pinching it properly. The transformation effect is pretty cool in this shot, but actually there's a far more complicated VFX process going on in this shot that's completely invisible. What you're looking at now is the footage completely out the camera with no post-production applied to it. As you can see, there's actually no camera move in this at all. Everything in this video is shot on a tripod, completely static. However, once I started editing this video, I realised that I really wanted the camera to pan up, so it would feel like the camera actually had to adjust to keep Venom in the frame, as he's so much larger than my body. What I decided to do was a digital set extension. The process for this is quite complicated. Essentially, it involves creating a larger version of the shot. So I scaled down my footage in the frame, so I had a load of blank space around the edges, and I used a few different techniques of warping and painting areas of the frame to stretch out the edges of the shot and create a larger clean plate. I had to make sure to denoise the footage first because, as you can see here, if I start to stretch it too much, it's actually stretching the grain, which you don't want. And doing that introduces all these strange streaks going across the ceiling. So denoising it gave me a nice clean base to start on. With the extended plate prepared, I then go into Blender and create a completely 3D version of the shot. To start out with, I just created a camera, brought in the background plate as a reference, and then did a simple animation on the camera, making it pan up at the point where I want Venom to transform and stand up. Then, looking from the camera's perspective, I made some simple geometry for the whole of my living room. I modelled all the angular parts of the walls and then created a floor and a ceiling. The idea with this is to bring it back into Nuke and project my extended plate onto this. I can use that in Nuke's 3D system to basically create a 3D camera move from my 2D plate. This works surprisingly effectively because although there's no movement in the original footage, projecting my clean plate onto this geometry gives the scene actual depth. To make this even more complicated than it already is, I also filmed some additional plates for this. I stepped out of the frame and then hid under the table and pushed it after a couple of seconds, basically creating a plate where Venom pushes the table away as he gets bigger. Then again, to sell the sense of parallax that this is moving in 3D space, I rotoed the bowl and the table and cut them out, and then projected these on a card in 3D space as well. And I placed this much closer to the camera, similar to where the table was compared to the real foreground and background in the shot. Pretty crazy, right? And after all that, you wouldn't even notice because most people would just assume someone else was operating the camera. I haven't even added Venom into the shot yet, so let's do that. The transformation effect is basically a combination of most of the techniques I've already shown in this video. I started out with Venom in the same sitting position that I was in and then animated him to stand up. As he's getting out of the chair, I also used some scale keyframes to increase his overall body size as well as him just moving upwards. I added some additional keyframes for the rest of the shot where Venom is fully transformed and turns his head towards the wall slightly, which leads us into the following shot. Then the actual transforming effect is a combination of two techniques. The first thing I did is created a new shape key for the entire body, and then I went into edit mode and scaled the entire model inwards based on the normals. The keyboard shortcut for this is Alt-S, and it just means that all the faces scale away from the direction they're facing in, essentially shrinking the model in on itself. This essentially creates a really skinny version of Venom that I can then just animate in and out for the transition. On top of this, I then used another displacement modifier and also keyframed the values within that to go from quite strong to about 10 frames in, going back down to 0 so it settles and the final transform happens. On its own, this effect looks a bit crazy and doesn't look super realistic, but with a combination of what I do next and some compositing, it all comes together pretty well in the end. So next up, I do pretty much exactly the same thing, but with a 3D model of me from a previous video. This 3D model of me is going to be set to a holdout, and then the model of Venom is essentially going to emerge from this 3D model from the inside. So I went through pretty much the same process again. I now animated the 3D model of me to do the same thing, so I'm matching my poses throughout the shot. Then once the animation is done, I set this model to a holdout, and as you can see, it now occludes parts of the Venom model that shouldn't be visible yet. This works quite effectively, but there were several frames where it felt like the displacement modifier was too strong, or parts of the body were coming through in the wrong areas, and I wanted a bit more creative control over what parts were coming on when. So I then created individual shape keys that I would just turn on and off for one frame, and sculpted the parts that I wanted to come through. Once I was happy with that, I did two separate renders, one with the holdout turned on and one with it turned off, which is just the Venom model on its own. The reason for this is while my animation was pretty accurate, it's very difficult to get a 3D holdout to be pixel perfect around the edges of my arms and things. So in Nuke, when I combine the two, this will allow me to draw some masks or paint individual frames in 2D to bring through bits of the model to the foreground where the holdout might not be working perfectly. I found this to be a really effective way to do the transition, and it's a good meeting point in the middle of doing it in 3D and a bit of 2D. One final detail that I was really keen to preserve in the transform was making my head go up really unnaturally high. I'm not a particularly tall person, and I've obviously made the Venom model significantly taller than myself, so what I did to bridge the gap between the real version of me and the full 3D model is I kept my face within the Venom head for a bit longer. So if I play it slowly, you can probably see exactly what I've done. I just took the footage of my face as I'm standing up, cut it out, and then tracked it onto the front of the Venom head instead so it has some additional movement. Then to sell in the contact with the Venom suit a bit more, I added some 2D shadows onto my face, so you feel like there's some contact shadows coming around the edges of my face as it's disappearing into Venom's head. It's animated to get slowly darker over about 7 frames, and also the mask around my face is slowly shrinking down, so you see less and less of it, until eventually it just disappears and dissolves off into the full Venom head. The final fully CG shot is actually very self-explanatory. I started by just blocking out the shot. This involved making some rough geometry for where the buildings would be, and then I animated Venom on top of that. The Venom rig is parented to a curve, which is where the jumping animation comes from, and the whole rig just animates along the curve. I added keyframes for it to stop and start at certain points, for example when he lands on the building and then does the second jump. Once I was happy with the speed and movement of the animation, I then created the city. I did this using the city generator add-on that I showed in my Spider-Man video, although this time it's a night scene. I moved the model around until I created the street that you see in the background, and then I also created some additional background buildings to fill out the city more. Lighting nighttime shots is actually very tricky. To start with, obviously I put the moonlight in the sky. I tried a few variations lighting it from the side, but I eventually found the scene looked best when it was backlit, so I put the moon behind Venom so he's jumping towards it at the end. I also brought in an HDRI of a night sky, and I set this to about 0.2 just so I had some very subtle bounce light in the scene. It's not adding any directional light, it's just filling in some of the shadows slightly. Then, like I was saying earlier about lighting Venom similarly to a car commercial, I started adding some spotlights specifically on Venom utilising light linking so they wouldn't affect the rest of the scene. As you can see here, I've got some spotlights off to the side, and I've used a track 2 constraint so they follow Venom throughout the shot. Without these, he basically got completely lost in the shadows. So these spotlights just ensure that there's always some highlights on him that make it easier to pick him out amongst the scene. The bricks that you see exploding at the beginning are using a rigid body simulation. All the bricks are individual objects, but they're connected together using constraints. I've got an icosphere that comes through and smashes a hole in the wall. Within the constraints there's a threshold, and so the bricks will stick together until they experience a certain amount of force, and then they will separate. It's pretty motion blurred, but you might be able to see there's a few chunks of bigger bricks and then a few individual ones that fly off as well. To create the hole in the wall is literally just 2 different pieces of geometry, one with a hole and one without, and then I animated the viewport and render visibility on and off, so over one frame they just changed to a different piece of geometry. Then I rendered this out from Blender and also exported the 3D camera and the building geometry so that I could use them in Nuke as well. This was a pretty simple shot to composite as it's fully CG. For the most part, I'm just using loads of cryptomats to do a bit of balancing within the shot. There were quite a lot of the background buildings that I felt were too bright or a bit of a strange colour, so I brought some of those elements that were catching my eye down a bit in Nuke. It's easier to do this with cryptomats rather than trying to isolate the lights and not make them catch certain things in Blender. That can get quite complicated. I also added a different sky in Nuke. I rendered the actual buildings on a transparent background so I could replace the sky later. In this case, I'm actually using a sky that I filmed for real off of my balcony, so it's just quite a generic overcast sky at night time. I wanted the moon to feel like it was behind the clouds and diffusing slightly through them, so I added a very strong glow onto it, which makes it softer and makes it feel like it's diffusing through the layers of atmosphere. The moon and that footage of the night sky are both projected on a massive sphere in Nuke's 3D system, and then I'm rendering them through the 3D camera. That then goes underneath everything, so that's the background layer on the comp. Then finally, I just added all the normal compositing bells and whistles to make the shot feel slightly more photographic. At the bottom of the script, I've got some lens distortion, some chromatic aberration, some slight softening at the edges of the frame, a bit of an overall glow just to make the highlights bloom slightly more. I also did a 3D defocus using the depth pass at the start of the shot, so I animated a slight rack focus where the depth of field is slightly shallower when we're looking at the bricks, and then it racks focus to a much deeper depth of field once the camera pans to the left and Venom moves away from the camera. This was done using the bokeh node, and I also added a lens kernel to create some slightly more interesting bokeh. I applied some actual camera shake to this shot just because I thought it'd be more organic. It's a bit of a DIY setup, but I basically put a couple of tracking markers on my monitor and then played the shot back and watched it while filming on my phone and just tried to move my phone to mimic what the real camera would be doing. So when Venom smashes through the wall and when he lands and takes off again, I just kind of jolted my body to make the camera shake a bit. Then I could track this in Nuke and apply that tracking data at the bottom of my script and actually implement this as camera shake with proper motion blur and everything. It's a lot more effective than the built-in camera shake node. Then all that was left to do was give it a nice color grade in Resolve, just to add a bit of contrast and make it look a bit nicer. And that, boys and girls, is how I recreated the VFX from Venom. I hope you enjoyed this video, it was really fun. As you might have seen from the post I made a while ago in the community tab on my channel, I've been in New York for a couple of months for work, which is why there was a bit of a gap on my channel. But obviously I'm back now, and I'm really looking forward to going into 2025 and making some more interesting videos. Leave a comment below on what effects you'd like to see me try next year. As always, all the assets from this video will be available on my Patreon, so if you'd like to download them and use them yourself, you're more than welcome to. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you soon.